Good evening, everybody. My name is Phil Dunlap. I am the director of Broward County's Cultural Division here in Broward County, Florida. We are reporting and broadcasting live from General Provisions in Fat Village. And for those of you that don't know Fat Village, it is the Arts and Technology District. And General Provision is a great co-working and creative space. They have a location here in Fat Village and in downtown Fort Lauderdale. So if you're looking for a great place, a co-working space, great amenities, great group of people, please check out our friends at General Provision. They're gracious enough to provide this space. I want to welcome you all to a very special evening here, a workshop that is going to deal with cultural competencies, and specifically looking at the role that the arts play in social change. Our goal for tonight is to provide attendees with an understanding of the evolution of diversity in the U.S., looking at important diversity milestones and trends, as well as current tensions derived from inequity and racism today. If we look at why this is important, we have no further to look than the demographics of Broward County, Florida. For those of you that live here or maybe don't even live here, Broward County, Florida is the third largest majority minority county in the country. There are almost 2 million people that live in this county, and there are almost 2 million people that call this county home. Sometimes in the arts, we get into the rut of thinking in a very white European, Eurocentric aesthetic of what art is. And the fact is that the demographics of our country and the demographics of this world are changing. And we as arts leaders and those of us that work for arts organizations have a responsibility to understand these changes, how to adapt, and how we address the aspects of systemic racism, inequality, and lack of access to the arts that we deal with here in our society. I also want to thank my team here at the Cultural Division, specifically our marketing team, both Madeline and Meredith, and also Jim in our grant section. Jim is the one that put this together. I also, before we want to get started, mention a couple things. I want to invite you to join us on October 29th at 4 p.m. We're going to be doing a virtual cultural forum for the Cultural Division, so please keep an eye on that for more information. And I also want to mention a very special opportunity through the Community Foundation of Broward. Their new RFP is going to be coming out and available October 5th. The objective of their new RFP is to use arts as a tool or a catalyst to heighten awareness, deepen knowledge about, and mobilize action on social justice issues. So the application can be for new or existing arts programs that focus on any of the many social justice issues, facing our community today, elements such as arts in education, health, economic development, human rights, racial inequality, LGBT, Q+ issues, violence, etc. Any variety of art forms can be used. So we're going to drop a link for more information, but that will be live after October 5th. They're also planning a convening for more information on October 14th at 9 a.m. via Zoom. So you can reach out to Angelica Rosas, the Strategic Grants Manager at the Community Foundation, for more information. I would now want to take just a second and introduce our speaker for tonight. Ola Mobolade is joining us from New York, specifically Brooklyn, I believe. If not, Ola, when you get on screen, you can certainly correct me. In addition to her role as marketing consultant, researcher, and strategist of choice to dozens of Fortune 500 companies, Ola is recognized as a thought leader on the evolving cultural landscape in the US and global markets. She co-authored the groundbreaking book, Marketing to the New Majority, Strategies for a Diverse World. She's been featured on NPR, Forbes, and The Economist. She's very passionate about culture in its various manifestations and holds dual degrees from Harvard University in psychology and Afro-American studies. She's a winner of the prestigious Atticus Award for Original Published Thinking in Communication Services and a longtime resident of New York City. I'd like to give a very big South Florida and beyond welcome to Ola Mobolade. Please join us and take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Phil. I'm going to have to record that intro and play it on a loop for myself. That was quite the intro. I am thrilled to be here. Thank you so much to the Broward County Cultural Division. Thank you to the Rockstar team that helped put this together. You all are amazing. And most importantly, I want to say thank you to everyone that decided to show up to do the work today. Everyone who's attending. I think it's important, right? The fact that you're here, the fact that you are open to learning, the fact that you have taken time out of your busy day is important to me. And it's important to this dialogue. Let's jump right in. I want to get into so much. And let me tell you guys, we're going to advance past the table of contents and go ahead and get into our first section. There's something I want to tell you, and that is that I'm used to the two-way dialogue. Like you guys, I am coping, sometimes, some days better than others, with the new pandemic reality. And I'm used to two-way dialogue. I spend a good portion of my time talking to consumers and talking to brands. And here's what we're going to do, since I don't have that luxury today. There is a comment section, and I see that all of you, the folks are already on it. This group is going to be great. And hello to everyone else, Mark, Petra. Wow, this is going to be a good time. I want you guys to use it specifically around questions, right? Questions will come up as we go. I'm not going to read every line on every slide. I'm going to trust that you guys can sort of follow along, and we're going to reserve a little bit of time on the back end to answer some of the questions you have live. So with that, why don't we jump right in? I want to set the stage just with one of my favorite quotes. If we move on to the next slide, from a guy named Ibram Kendi. And if you haven't heard of or read the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, check it out. There's a really interesting concept that was sort of new to me in this sort of 2020 resurgence of the dialogue. Keep in mind, I've been in the cultural strategy space for 20 years, so I've seen a bit of an evolution. I'm going to clue you in on some of the newest changes, but one of the important things that Phil queued up beautifully is that it's a time and place and climate where you've got to pick a side. This isn't a place where there's room for sitting on the sidelines. And I really am encouraged by the allies that have showed up to support communities of color. You have taken an anti-racist stance by self-educating. You've taken an anti-racist stance by being open today, and I thank you for that. Let's go right into some of the themes that are going to define our conversation today. I'm probably committing the biggest sin of storytelling, and I am summing up my entire presentation in one slide, but that's because there's a story arc that's important. There are three things that I want to make sure that we all understand before we get into some of the nitty gritty. One is probably impossible to ignore. We are in a changing time. There's a cultural revolution, if you haven't noticed. The world's changing, right? And depending on what side of things that you sit on, you'll either think about this as necessary growing pains, the sort of racial tensions and social unrest and protest and political insanity. You'll think about it either as, sort of a moment that we are collectively going through together to get to a better place, and that's how I like to think of it. Or you might think about it as a moment of reckoning, and I think both of those are valid. There is an under-discussed sort of conversation, reconciliation, if you will, that America hasn't had. And so it's happening now. Now, because of that, and because we have been really sort of euphemistic and swept things under the rug historically, there's some catching up to do, and that's what I'm here to help with, and at least sort of trigger some thoughts, depending on where you are. Again, everyone will be at a different point along this evolution of becoming culturally competent, and so I'll try to talk at all levels. Now, if you are in the arts, and I suppose there's a good chance you are if you're listening, you might be aware that the arts have come under scrutiny in some very public ways recently. Specific institutions, galleries and museums and so on, because of a lack of diversity or lack of focus on things like inclusion and equity. Just to make you feel a little bit better, there is not a corner of this society that is not under similar scrutiny. What is the difference, and what I hope will be helpful, is that some sectors have been working on those issues for a while, right? So we can learn lessons that we can apply if you're just kind of getting into that. If you're thinking for the first time about seriously committing to developing a culture of inclusion, if you're thinking about what you can do to sort of dismantle some culturally insensitive or microaggressive norms, do not fear, right? Others have come before you, and I'm going to share some thoughts and insights from those groups. And then finally, the reason we're doing this, again, Phil had a really just perfect setup for that, is the idea that there is no downside of getting better cultural understanding, right? Whether you're an artist who really tries to examine the human condition and provoke emotion and thought, and a back and forth dialogue, whether you're an administrator who is really, pushing to diversify the folks that your institution speaks to, wherever you sit along the spectrum, if you're in the corporate world like me, there is a benefit and an upside. What I love about the arts piece is that you all in the arts, especially artists, have a certain set of permissions to really force us to have conversations. You speak a language that can bring us together, and the more you understand these dynamics, the better you can do that. So let's go on, and I want to tell you a little bit about the frustration that I know is on both sides. We're going to, by the way, talk about some things that are tough conversations to have publicly sometimes. I mean, the problem with having a really productive conversation around racial issues and imbalance and racism is that it becomes difficult from a couple perspectives to speak freely. And that's one of the things I want to make sure I address from the beginning, right? So you've got folks who are well-meaning, who are kind of afraid to say the wrong thing. They don't want to offend people of color. They don't want to offend Black folks. And I appreciate that. Please keep on not offending. But one of the issues or frustrations I'm sure that at least a couple of you might identify with is this fact or idea that it becomes hard to know what's right, wrong, acceptable, unacceptable, to keep up with the trends and language in what's appropriate if you can't have that open dialogue. So let me just validate that as a real frustration. On the other hand, people of color who have been experiencing this from a completely different perspective, this 2020 moment for us and many of your colleagues, if you're a white person, or many of your colleagues, I bet, of color are experiencing this. We have suddenly become the designated educator of all things race and culture. And let me tell you this. It is not bad that you are asking your closest person of color to help you understand these ideas. However, I want to just introduce the thought that you multiply your questions to that person times several times a day, times every day, times every week, times every month and year, and it does sort of feel like we're being asked to do the work. One of my friends likes to say, I know the answer, but guess who else does? Google. We don't have a special Google. It's the same Google as everyone else. So the answer to both sides is that your frustration is valid, but also let's be a little more patient, right? Let's give opportunities for learning from each other, some space to breathe. The good news is that I do this for a living, and I bet you have folks in your orbit who do as well. My first tip, this one's for free, is that you pay them to help you get to where you're going in terms of your goals around culture, race, inclusion, and equity. So moving right along, right, because I want to play part of that role of bridge, I want to talk a little bit about the language of cultural identity, because if it seems tough to keep up with, it's because it is. It's always changing. You're not imagining things. The names and words and terms are always changing. What I want to tell you is not that you've got to memorize all of the right terms, because this isn't about sort of rote repetition. What I want you to walk away with, if nothing else, is an understanding of the reason why these terms change, and the reason that it's important to call people by their preferred cultural identifiers. You know, the idea of this sort of evolving discussion on race is very much a function of the voice and the sort of author of the narratives about people of color, right? There is a shifting or recentering of who gets to tell our stories. And as that happens, some of the words that we use to talk about the groups change. Add to that the fact that cultural identity is fluid. And it is situational. So just as an example, I'm very aware when I'm giving this talk that I'm a woman of color. When I'm, I don't know, buying shoes or, you know, eating my dinner at home, not thinking about it so much. So that's what we mean by it being situational, and that it evolves. I'll get more into that in a moment. But let me talk about the term that is correct, or that is sort of the respectful term for African Americans or Black. That's what we're using now. If we go to the next slide, the point I wanted to make here is that there's a reason why you're hearing certain terms pop up. We can get into a bubble of our own in the sort of diversity and culture professional space, where we forget that not everyone uses all these terms all the time. But some of you will be familiar with the fact that BIPOC is something you might have heard. Someone asked me recently, is it BIPOC? You can say it either way. Most people say BIPOC. POC is also acceptable for people of color. We're not really using minorities that much anymore. And I bet you can guess why. It has to do with the shift and evolution and the demographic landscape that is itself changing what it means to be a minority or part of a majority in America. Black and brown people is another term that is acceptable. I use it. Not everyone feels comfortable saying Black or brown. So that's one of the spaces where POC, or people of color, comes in. Just so you know a little bit of the context behind BIPOC. The sequence has a little bit to do probably with the pronounceability of an acronym like BIPOC. Probably sounds better than, I don't know, PBOCI, I don't know. So, but it also, you know, purposefully calls out or isolates the Black and Indigenous experience from other people of color. It doesn't make it more important. It separates it just because it's a nice reminder in this sort of hierarchy of letters that the experience of those who are Native Americans or Indigenous, and the experience of those who are descendants of African slaves in America, is a really sort of different story than the immigrant story in America. So you see a little bit of sort of unconscious or subtle tip of the hat to that distinction when we put Black and Indigenous first. But in any case, this is a term you can use instead of minorities and feel all the way comfortable. In terms of African American, which we'll talk about next, I had a whole sort of mini lecture in mind for talking through that. But then I stumbled upon this amazing video clip that sort of tells the story of the correct language and the history behind why it's important to us better than I ever could. So let's go ahead and advance to that and play that video.
Look at my African American over here. Look at him. Are you the greatest? So we have an African American guy at one of the rallies a month ago.
The Black church, the Black businesses.
Black. African American.
people of colors.
Your role reserved for colored people.
Since we've been here in America, we've had all these different names for ourselves, either thrust upon us or ones we chose, from colored to Negro to Afro-American to Black to African American. There's the problematic words of Spanish and Portuguese colonialism and their slave trade. So the Blacks were called Negroes in both languages, so they were just called Blacks. So we use the word Negro. If you say colored people, that smacks of the 40s.
Black power means the saving grace of our United States.
The late 50s, early 60s, civil rights activists, on the more radical end, were starting to say, we are not colored people, we're not Negroes, we are Black. They wanted to go all the way. In that same way, saying, well, not white. So they really planted a really strong flag for the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, the Black Arts movement, and the song. Jesse Jackson proclaimed one day in the late 80s, we are now going to call ourselves African American. And a lot of people just thought, well, who were they to decide what we're going to call ourselves now? And it felt at first like a step backwards because Black really was a big catch-all, but also so powerful.
I don't know how far back, and I don't know what country in Africa I'm from. I'm not an African American, I'm an American.
It really depends on the context. I think that Black is just a fantastic, positive word that everybody should feel free to use.
I'm going to help the African Americans for the African American, making our inner cities better for the African American.
By adding the to it and the S at the end, the Blacks, it just shows how sort of tone deaf they are. Harks back to kind of an old-fashioned, non-PC look at us as some kind of other to be afraid of.
I have a great relationship with the Blacks. I've always had a great relationship with the Blacks. Unfortunately,
I can't not tease Jay about the kind of like brother way he was taught to talking, like, hey, with the rap music in the background. There would be some people that feel that you co-opted something like that.
It's also interesting because I'm actually Black, but you assumed otherwise. And this is the sort of arguments we look forward to.
Absolutely. I think, can I raise the colors? No, but on top of all that, I am clearly brown skin, and people are always saying to me, you talk white.
So let's go ahead to the next slide. So kind of a lighthearted way of addressing it, but one of the things that I hope you take away from this is just the importance of centering it on the group that you're talking about. The folks who have permission to define the term are the folks who belong to that cultural group. One last point, you're going to start to see Black American come up as a sort of more standardized approach for some of the reasons they touched on. It's not as mainstream yet as Black and or African American, but it's something that we'll probably start to hear a lot more of. Now, going to the next slide, there's an interesting debate brewing about the correct terminology for U.S. Hispanics. And my default and my advice is, whenever you're unsure, if you have an opportunity, ask people what they prefer to be called. And I'll tell you, there's a study that I came across from a group called Think Now that helps me feel like, Hispanic is appropriate. Latinx is one of those terms that has very valid sort of I think I might have disappeared for a moment, but let's move on to the next slide. I want to just pause briefly on the idea that there are some sort of grammatical standards, right? That there are, it's not all relative. We capitalize white and black. We hyphenate African American when it's an adjective, and so on. We want to avoid, you know, as the video touched on, referring to the blacks or the whites. When we're talking about multiple groups, let's say we're talking about Black and Hispanic, we're not saying the Black and Hispanic community, we're saying Black and Hispanic communities because there are more than one. These are guidelines, okay? So it's not as though, you know, it's about memorizing, but language and calling people by their preferred names, as it were, is a sign of respect. So just as there are microaggressions, there's sort of micro gestures that demonstrate intercultural respect. Let's go on, and we're sort of winding down the 101, right? I want to share with you some of what's happening in the evolving world of cultural diversity. First of all, you might have heard that people are using the acronym DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's one of the reasons is that one of the lessons of those of us that have been sort of applying it, let's say in a brand or corporate or marketing realm, is that diversity without inclusion and equity is problematic. It doesn't really work. It's not sustainable. So that's why you'll tend to see those three words grouped together. You'll see, you know, people who are the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at organizations and companies. Understanding the dynamics are more important than ever. Why is that? Well, when we go to the next slide, we see something that helps me remember that this isn't some future trend that we're looking toward, this shift in the very makeup of America. It really is happening now in real time. So 4 out of 10 Americans are part of what for the time being is still ethnic minority groups or ethnic or racial minority groups. But I want to make clear that when we talk about the importance of diversity and equity and inclusion, it's not just for people of color. If you've talked to a millennial lately or someone from Gen Z, you know that they are, generally speaking, quite passionate and much more than older generations about the importance of diversity. As a person who does a lot of sort of research around advertising and effective messaging, I can tell you that these days, if you were to show a commercial to a group of white Gen Z viewers or consumers, they would say, "Where's the diversity? You know, the commercial's obviously missing something." So there's. If we go to the next slide, we see not just the shameless plug for my book, Marketing to the New Majority. We also see this concept of sort of thinking about not just these ethnic minorities that will soon collectively comprise majority. We're also talking about that portion of the non-Hispanic white population that feels an affinity toward, or feels that they are influenced by, or feels like they're allies to these groups. So it really is sort of shaking up notions of who is majority and who is minority when we think about diversity as a value. Going on, I want to, again, underscore the idea that this is a phenomenon, and particularly as we talk about the majority-minority switchover, that has already taken place among the younger generation. As of 2019, kids under 10 were more likely to be people of color than they were to be white. As you think about communities and growing connections with them, it's important to keep that in mind, that this isn't a niche issue. This isn't an issue for Black and brown people alone. This is the new normal. Going ahead to the next slide, you know, I touched on this idea of 2042 being that tipping point moment, right? Part of it has to do with the fact that population growth among white non-Hispanics is leveling off, or it's not growing as much, and it's increasing at a much higher level for segments of color. So in our lifetime, in about 20 years, in fact, give or take, we're going to see the country be majority minority. So there are some implications to that are important to understand. If we go on to the next slide, we, Phil touched on this, right? And I think as a group that has its heartbeat in Southern Florida, this is a reality that's not foreign to most of you, at least those of you that are from Broward County. But 4 of the US states are already majority minority. Several others are at the tipping point. And if we keep on going, one of the elements on the next slide that will also sort of mark a shift is that the fastest growing group out of, well, first of all, the fastest 3 growing groups are Asian Americans, US Hispanics, and multiracial people. So biracial, people that are 2 or more races or ethnicities are the fastest growing group. And, so that kind of multiculturalism that we've been talking about at a macro level all along is very much manifest at that individual level as well, even at the household level. By 2025, so just 4 years and some change, we're going to be in a place where over half of households with children will be multi-ethnic households, right? So again, the future is now. Moving on to the next slide, I want to just let you know that there's some changes among those of us who have professional roles related to culture and ethnicity and race and inclusion. And one of those really sort of established trends at this point or changes is in expanding the way that we talk about diversity. So it's not just race and ethnicity. And it makes sense when we think about the fact that 5% of the US is LGBT, 13% are disabled, 7% are veterans. And in fact, I can tell you, as someone kind of on the front lines, someone who works with 22 out of the Fortune 100, that we are actually, sort of thinking about multiculturalism and diversity along all of these lines. And if we go to the next slide, I just want to quickly speed through a couple things. One is that it's important that you're understanding whether you are looking at LGBTQ plus versus LGBT. Q standing for queer and sort of encompassing a spectrum, because you'll see different population figures. Identify. If we move on to the next slide, I mentioned the idea of companies and marketing professionals really thinking about people with disabilities or people who are differently abled. And one of the things that we try to pay attention to is the fact that not all of these disabilities are visible. So it becomes a little bit more nuanced than it seems on the surface. And on the next slide, just the point here being around veterans being part of the diversity conversation here, even though the majority of US veterans around today are white males. That is very much a group that has experienced marginalization, and that's why we're kind of inviting them to the fold of the diversity conversation. Going on to the next slide. There are, it's interesting to look at the reasons that companies have focused on diversity. And I'll tell you, I've never seen so much focus on the issue as I have in 2020. And again, I've been in this space for quite some time. I'll tell you, the reasons for companies really investing their time and attention are changing quite a bit. It used to be kind of, the thing that you had to do. It was sort of legal requirement. And we sort of forced this idea that it was the right thing to do. And I'll tell you now, more than anything, there's a clear business case for investing in the understanding of and sort of forging connections with diverse groups from a brand and company perspective. On the next slide, the next few slides, I'll tell you what we mean by the business case. Well, first, there is hard, cold cash, right? There's the fact that there is untapped spending power in the diverse segments that have traditionally been ignored or sort of assumed to be captured by what we call general market programming on TV and communications and so forth. So that's one of the reasons, right? Because there's growth coming primarily from those groups. From a population perspective, multiply that by their spending power, and it's a no-brainer. Moving on to the next slide, groups like McKinsey & Company, management consulting companies who are not sort of historically focused on diversity have started doing analyses that have pointed to a very quantifiable competitive advantage of companies that are more diverse. They're 36% more likely to outperform their competitors. So the business case is, again, very tangible. And then finally, on the next slide, we are, I love food, so you'll see lots of metaphor around food here, but there's something interesting that we notice when we think about the way that America has addressed and sort of defined through metaphor, multiculturalism, and specifically I want to talk about the interplay between national and cultural identity. We talk about a melting pot. Well, that was very assimilationist, right? It's assumed that we all sort of shed the identities of wherever we came from as a nation of immigrants and all became one thing. That actually isn't aligned with American values. America, one of the unique and beautiful things about the US is that we are a culture who values retention of your identity from your country of origin or from your culture that you identify with. So there was a mixed salad metaphor that was going, popular in some circles, among demographers, among sociologists for a while. The problem I felt with that, and my co-author David, we thought, well, gosh, there's not really room for intercultural influence. In other words, the tomato doesn't become more lettucey because it lives next to the lettuce. And so we thought there was a better metaphor. And on the next slide, you'll see sort of the chicken soup idea. And the reason I wanted to point out the chicken soup sort of thought, and it becomes one that's hopefully intuitive, right? Is that if we think about American culture as the broth, well, how does broth get its flavor? It's actually absorbing the flavors of the seasonings and the ingredients that are in it. And so very much in the same way, American culture has been seasoned over time by the various ingredients, the chicken, the noodles, the veggies. Think of those as the various cultural groups that have sort of shaped what we call and know as Americana. It's a very distinctive thing. But here's the thing, and the important sort of distinction. I don't know if you have had soup lately, but the vegetables, the chicken and the noodles, guess what? They taste like the broth, right? So they're also absorbing this American influence. So there's back and forth influence that we are starting to sort of talk about as a mainstream idea in this space. Ethnic cultures don't live in silos, right? If you put a message out there for a Hispanic consumer on the marketing side, the brand world, it doesn't mean that other people don't see it, right? If you are African American, you are not just consuming African American media and so on. So intercultural influence is a fact of American multiculturalism, as is, if we go to the next slide, this idea of polyculturalism. And I know I'm getting deep into the word stew here, but all we really mean when we talk about polyculturalism is that you can be 100% American and 100% affiliated with a country of origin or a culture that is distinct from American culture. And in fact, if we look at data, we can see that, people who identify with ethnic cultures really are looking very much to express that pride, and America allows for that. Onto the next slide, another sort of mainstream trend in the marketing world is this idea of retroculturation. In other words, there was a time, and I probably caught the end of it, where our parents urged us to be as American as possible, right? Where it was very much about assimilation. Well, we're seeing a pendulum swing back in the other direction, where you know, folks who maybe didn't grow up learning their parents' language in their homes are sort of seeking that out now, and that's happening across a number of groups that are looking to reclaim their heritage, and we can see that manifest in some of these cultural identity companies that help you track via DNA where you come from. If we go on to the next slide, you know, this is also something that we see in sort of a resurgence of folks clinging to family cultural traditions. And one of the things I want to be clear about is that, you know, the idea of having a culture is not just for people of color. And I think we know this intuitively, but sometimes we forget that. Going on to the next slide, you know, there is an element of diversity that is so sort of obvious when we think about it, but again, very under discussed, and that has to do with country of origin when we talk about racial and ethnic groups. For instance, on the next slide, when we speak about being Black in America, that doesn't always mean being African American. There is something called the African Diaspora, right? There are Black folks everywhere. And 9% of the US Black population is foreign born. I am among that 9%. Similarly, on the next slide, we see with US Hispanics, cultural identity really being intrinsically tied, and very closely so, to country of origin. So in this group, we have about a third of the population that's foreign born. And that doesn't mean to suggest that those are the only folks that feel a strong tie. We have a really sort of a robust group of what we call, you know, bicultural or polycultural Hispanics who, again, they might not have been born in their parents' country of origin, but they very much do identify with them. And we see something similar on the next slide among Asians. Asian Americans are much more likely to sort of identify with multiple cultures. Only 14%, if you ask them about their identity, say that they are American only. And you can see kind of the sort of spread of cultural identities that, quite frankly, makes it a little bit of a misnomer to talk about the Asian segment as though they're a monolith. Going on to the next slide, I want to just really quickly breeze through this idea that when we think about the fact that there's a dispersal of different ethnic groups across the US, we really have an interesting sort of form of intersectionality kind of enter into the identity soup. If we go to the next slide, one of the things that you'll notice, and this is going to be a different story for each of the segments, African Americans are concentrated in the Southeast. So 60%, well over half of African Americans live in 10 states in the US, which is something that you probably want to have your eye on as you think about sort of national programs, if that's on your radar. On the next slide, we see with Hispanic Americans, there is dispersal, but we definitely see, I think, that there are clusters of folks affiliating or coming from certain countries of origin in certain groups. So if we think about the US Hispanic population in, say, New York, it's different than it is in, let's say, California. Now, we see a similar pattern among Asian Americans where we don't see necessarily all of the groups in terms of country of origin dispersed evenly. We definitely see pockets. So when we think about the general population in the US, it's going to be specific to the region, the state, the county that we're in. So it's important to keep in mind. Now, if we move on, I want to do a quick exercise, and I'm not going to read every slide here, but I wanted to just make sure that you guys can sort of think about this in a personal way, right? We talk about race and ethnicity and culture and identity, and I'm not certain that we've done a great job of clarifying what the differences are. So I'm going to run through this exercise using myself, but I want you to think about what you would say if someone asked you what your culture is, and same for the other terms. So go to the next slide. Culture is really something that bonds a group of people, that connects them via common language or common customs or arts or sort of norms. So it can be related to ethnicity. It can be related to nationality. Anyone who works in an office, you might be a part of a very specific corporate culture. If you're a fan of hip hop, you might really identify with hip hop culture. It doesn't necessarily mean race and ethnicity. If we keep on going, identity is much broader. That's when we talk about identity, we talk about a self-perception. So no one can impose identity labels on you, and the respectful thing is to sort of address folks' identity in the way that is important to them. Moving on through the next few slides, for race, I mean, I think this one's one of the ones that we're more familiar with. African American and Black, for me, would be the racial affiliation. And if we go on to ethnicity, there's a distinction that's maybe not as clear here. When we're talking about ethnic groups, we're talking about a group that has a heritage or tie or cultural affiliation with somewhere abroad. So they're in the minority typically in their country. So here in the US, I'm part of an ethnic group that's Nigerian. If I'm in Nigeria, I wouldn't call that an ethnic group, right? Because I'm where my folks are. Heritage has much more to do with passed down traditions, passed down, foods and so on. Little point of interest. I have heritage or strains of my heritage that connect to Britain because Nigeria was a British colony, and my tribe and the region of Africa I'm from. If we go to the next slide, we can see that nationality is a very different thing. For me, I'm American and I'm Nigerian. I have passports for both countries, and I feel connected deeply to both. So hopefully that sort of brings it down to the individual level. As we start to wrap up, I think we have a time for a little bit more, but I want to talk about very quickly, if we go to the next slide, the importance of understanding that despite the progress, despite the growth in power and spending power, all those great things I just showed you, there is a degree of marginalization that's still happening with ethnic minorities. And if we go on to the next slide, this is a very sort of charty slide that talks about, sort of who is experiencing it. And on the next slide, we see that, some of it is very overt, as the previous slide shows, in terms of experiencing discrimination. And some of it is just the idea of being self-conscious of the way that you display your identity. Look up the Crown Act when you get a moment, and you'll get a little bit of a window into sort of the policing of culture and ethnicity and the way we express it. Sometimes I'm asked whether consumers or people or sort of communities of color want brands or companies or organizations to talk about social issues. Is it too political? Well, I am here to tell you, with data behind it, that these groups are looking for companies to take a stand. And one of the ways that we've seen this manifest is through the Black Lives Matter discourse. If we go to the next slide, we can see that particularly we're seeing frustration from Black and Hispanic adults when it comes to companies really sort of showing that they care about the values important to these groups. And on the next slide, we'll see that both Hispanic Americans and African Americans who are asked about whether brands should have sort of a role, should have a voice, they're absolutely saying yes. And in fact, there is a heightened degree of sort of loyalty or return on investment, if you want to get very corporate about it, when we are speaking up and choosing that side that supports the equality of all these groups. Say similar numbers for the African American segment. And if we go to the next slide, we see that this is a phenomenon that is shared across multiple diverse segments, some more than others. African Americans are feeling neglected or frustrated, or like they're an afterthought in terms of the way that companies market to, to them or to them as part of a diverse general market or audience. Going on to the next slide, I want to just emphasize that as we, as you notice, that there's a lot of emphasis and focus on Black issues right now, I just want to make sure that we're clear on the reason why. There's a really sort of dark intersection of factors, and most of them you're probably very familiar with. We've got COVID disproportionately affecting Black people and brown people. We've got the sort of toxic policing culture at play, and so we've got sort of the protest, the social angst at a very heightened level. So what do Black and brown communities want from brands or companies or organizations who are speaking out? Well, let me tell you, you're already engaged in part of what they're looking for us to do. One is to seize the moment to raise our cultural IQ. That's exactly part of this journey that we're all on together. Part of it is creating safe spaces for Black and brown voices to be heard. And, if you really sort of want to get serious about examining whether you have work to do as an organization, you'll do a bit of an audit of the culture of your organization. And finally, the idea of promoting transparency and accountability. So I want to, let's go ahead to the next couple slides. I want to leave some time for us to talk, but there are a couple things. We can go on to the next slide there, and the one after this is one that I'll just pause on for a moment, because one of the exercises that I think is really interesting is a collection I've done and others have done of responses that brands have sort of publicly put out there, mostly via social media, about following the murder of George Floyd. One of the sort of striking trends that I noticed is that there was a sort of homogenous white on Black statement that some of us in the advertising and marketing community ultimately, when we took a step back, we thought it was kind of strange that everyone kind of almost took what felt like a templated approach, almost robotic and inhuman. If we go to the next slide, these are principles more for companies. I think that we learned quite a bit, and a couple of the key principles that I just think do carry over is the importance of sustaining, right? The importance of not just a one and done approach. I put up a statement, good for me, pat on the back. I think that when we think about what's most valuable to these groups that we are seeking to be allies with, it is a real investment in action. It is a real sort of commitment that is extended over time, and it's showing some transparency. And there were several brands that did that well, and others not so well. I won't put any of them on the spot. Moving along to the next slide, we also, I think I wanted to just share a couple things. Now, the arts community, I mentioned in the beginning that there's been some scrutiny, but there have been some steps that we've seen in the last few years, and in 2020 specifically. I wanted to end my talk and transition into the conversation that we're gonna have in terms of Q&A by just pointing out a couple of the principles that have come up as I've been working with art institutions that are really sort of doing the work, so to speak. Some of the things that we want to do is find some structure around changes that we want to make. The one-offs are great, but I think we can get to much more lasting change when we think about things like defining a vision and a mission, forming a task force, getting a sense of how and where your organization stands relative to your peers, and really thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion as a journey, right? It's not something that we complete in a month or a year, certainly not in a 1 hour talk. But that being said, there are a couple best practices. But you know, each of these, by the way, I'm going to just sort of touch on. There are great examples of institutions that are doing these well. They are thinking about things like broadening job qualifications to diversify. They're thinking about developing strong mentoring programs to kind of bring different faces into the arts community, paid internships, because not everyone can afford to go work for free for a prestigious institution. They're reorganizing their various sort of departments and groups to align with their values. They're creating pathways to culture and employment for new communities so that we're not just speaking to the same people, that we're bringing new folks in. And finally, they are using partnerships to reach new communities. So I could obviously talk about this forever and ever, but I think Phil has some questions for me that I want to make sure I touch on that may be coming in through some of the comments that I see up here on the feed. So Phil, I'll hand over to you.
Hey, Ola, this has been great and a lot of information to go through, a lot for folks to think about. I would encourage those of you, watching online, if you have any specific questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll do our best to get some of those. I wanted to, before we get to some of those questions, really ask you to expand maybe a bit on how organizations can responsibly approach this work of being, and I'll say anti-racist. That's a concept that you brought up in the very beginning. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a very stark term, and I think people's reactions is to ultimately put up walls in the very beginning and say, we're not racist, you know, what are you saying? So what, you know, can you expand on just a little bit about what it means to be anti-racist? And then and sort of a second part is so much about that work, and this work is about giving up power and giving voice to those that have not traditionally had that power. And we see this in the arts. It's not only in the arts, but those of us at the top, you know, in those sort of power positions tend to be white, white male, cisgender. I'm looking at myself in the mirror, and a lot of damage can be done on good intentions. And so I think organizations really struggle with how they can approach this work and giving up that power in a responsible way that doesn't cause damage in their to do something responsible.
Right. That really great questions. Just to touch on the anti-racist piece, it sounds, it is a new sort of way of thinking about it. And I think one of the things that, you know, especially in How to Be an Anti-Racist, the book, that is laid out is that there isn't sort of a middle space, right? There isn't a place for you to sort of be neutral, because racism sort of is really hinging on the systemic, you know, sort of oppression of a people. There is no way to, we either participate in it or we participate in dismantling it, essentially, right? I think you also asked a question in there about, you know, giving up power. And one of the things I try to do is start to, it's tough, but pull some of the emotionality and some of the sort of gut reaction, you know, whether it's guilt or shame or defensiveness out of the conversation. Because when we talk about things like privilege, folks who have gone through, you know, sort of tough experiences who don't feel privileged might resent that term, right? And when we talk about privilege, we're really talking about a set of sort of systems and structures that benefit, you know, one group more than others. And so I always urge clients and teams that are looking to really embody anti-racist principles to think about just listening for a while, right? There's that urge, that knee-jerk reaction to sort of defend your humanity, defend the fact that you're a good person, and I think I want to acknowledge that I think most people that even those that slip up sometimes and make mistakes sometimes are good people. It's not about sort of individual discriminatory acts as much as it is about sort of examination of some of the systems that are inherently unfair. When we can take a second and sort of, think about the fact, it's like having an American accent, right? You don't notice it, but you have an American accent that doesn't really seem like anything until you're, in another country. Systemic racism and unconscious bias is very much the same, right? We all have those. And another recommendation would be to take an implicit bias test, for yourself. You don't have to share it with anyone. I think it's an interesting way to sort of confront some of this stuff that gets embedded just by nature of the fact that we grew up in this country.
You brought up the idea that so much of, or the fact that so much of what we deal with racism, with inequalities, are built on these racist systems. These are systemic issues, and I think a lot of smaller organizations or large organizations struggle with how do they as institutions deal with systemic issues when they exist in this system as well. So you can sort of change and impact what's in your immediate purview, and you can lead by example, but you still exist in a racist system or one that's not fair. So how can arts organizations or organizations in general feel like they're making headway, and when they may just be,
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I'll tell you a great example of where this comes up. I'm working with an arts institution that wants to diversify. They recognize, and this is the story across a number of organizations. They realize that, they don't have representative diversity, and they want to do something about it. So then they go out and they look to hire, and they say, gosh, you know what, the candidates just aren't there. Well, here's the thing. If you go to the same places that we've always gone, specifically around finding talent, we run into the barriers of that are remnants of those systemic inequities. So, for instance, I've looked at the percentage of MFA graduates across the U.S., and it's really small. It's something like 3%. So, guess what? If we are very rigid about the way that we define the best possible candidates, if we are very traditional about them, it's like going to a dry well, right? It means working around the system. It means reimagining those things that might be self-defeating barriers that make it difficult for us. Go to, for instance, HBCUs, go to historically Black colleges and universities, go to cultural organizations that might be your neighbors in your community. It's a little bit of work to kind of step outside of traditional structures and systems, but it makes the job of advancing diversity much easier.
Yeah, I think there's in the arts, I mentioned this in the beginning, we can get hung up on a very institutionalized idea of what art is and the aesthetic of art, which tends to be a very Eurocentric, white, European viewpoint of things. The major cultural institutions are institutions and art forms that were born out of Europe, and when you see them, the operas, the ballets, the symphonies, and this is in no way to say that these are not legitimate or not important forms of art. Right. But you see them pop up then in South America and other countries. You realize that the reason why they're there is because of colonization and is really rooted in this dark history in our past. But if we step outside of what that center, what is defined as what is normal, good, what is proper, whether it's hiring people, whether it's our training programs, I think that's where our arts organizations struggle. We in this mode of this art, this is good, this is where we're missing this whole
Yeah, there's something really exciting happening, I think, in the contemporary art world on the commercial side as well, just in terms of a new sort of space and stage. You talked about sort of yielding your time, right, to folks of color, and there are some really fantastic artists of color who are forcing folks to think about the sort of European standards that define high culture. I also want to say that in the classical performing arts, orchestras and so on, there have been really interesting steps taken that I think we can learn from in terms of countering some or dismantling some of the barriers to diversity that they've been sort of scrutinized for over the years. It's very interesting, especially when we think about institutions that are funded by public monies, that they are being forced, or it started as being forced, to be creative about how they attack this issue, right? And I think there's a lot to learn when we sort of look at what some of those are doing.
Yeah, and you bring up a lot of great points, and I think we're going to wrap up here very shortly. Before we do, you gave some examples of organizations that are good case studies. I think those were the slides. And I'm wondering if you could tell us about one or maybe two organizations briefly that you think are doing really great work in this space, that our viewers could possibly go and search and
as a matter of fact,
and for everybody watching, this is being recorded, so this is supposed to go back and look at the slides and see.
Right. As a matter of fact, there is a really cool landmark paper for those of you that want to nerd out like I do on the topic that really lays out a bunch of case studies. And in fact, the slides that I showed you at the end were excerpted from that. It was, and I want to get the name right, it was called Interrogating Institutional Practices in Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, Lessons and Recommendations from Case Studies in 8 Art Museums. Lisa Sweeney and Roger Schoenfield are the authors of that 2018 paper. So I encourage you to look it up. The Brooklyn Museum and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago are 2 examples where, they just as you think about programming and education, some institutions kind of put those in different buckets or silos. They've sort of blown up some of those silos in interesting ways. There are some cautionary tales in some of these as well. We've seen the Studio Museum and in Harlem and Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston do some really interesting things around mentorship programs. I know that sometimes we're thinking short term about diversifying, but we've got to plant seeds. Otherwise, we're going to run into the same issues 10 and 15 and 20 years from now. And part of that is mentorship. So that, I would encourage folks to look at that paper and get inspired.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ola, for joining us from the cold tundra up north. Actually, I'm sure it's probably not that cold just yet, but I know you'll be enjoying some very bitter temperatures probably in the not too distant future. So come join
the reminder
sometime in South Florida. We'd love to have you. I want to thank everybody for joining us on the internet, both on Facebook and on our YouTube channel. Again, thank you all. It was a great presentation. I know this will not be the last time that our paths cross. I want to thank my staff and my team here at the Cultural Division, Meredith and Madeline and Jim Shermer for their work on this, and our friends at Art Hive for helping us produce and make this a wonderful show. Keep an eye out for our information on our annual cultural forum, again, which will be Thursday, October 29th at 4 p.m. We're going to get a great retrospective about what's been going on, some plans for the future, some very special guests that you're going to learn about, and I think it's going to be an exciting night. So again, thank you. Thanks to our friends at General Provision. This is a great venue for us to be at, and we look forward to many, many more. In the meantime, be safe, be well, and treat the arts like they are your children. All right? Thanks.